By the end of this video, you're going to learn how to use the post-process volume to turn your boring-looking scenes from this to this. And guess what? We're also going to teach you how to use the path tracing rendering engine to get the most physically accurate scene.
What is up, beautiful people? Welcome to chapter 10 of our Unreal Engine beginner tutorial series. Today, we are going to talk about post-process volume.
Wow, you made it until chapter 10?
It's amazing.
You are good. You are good.
Great job.
Today's video, this one right here, is going to be one of the easiest. Honestly, it's going to be a breeze, and it's going to be also one of the best because what we're actually going to do is bring in something into our scene called the post-process volume. Now, the post-process volume acts as an extra final filter on top of all of your renders, which makes them look beautiful. This is where you can add glow and bloom, add vignette to your screen, even film grain, things of that sort. Control the exposure. Usually, post-process volume is added in the beginning of our projects, like right in the beginning, right in the start, so you can control the look of your scene. It just didn't make sense to do it this time around because we had to go through the paces, go from materials, modeling
lighting,
and all that. But you want to do this in the very beginning. We always do it in the start. So this is how you can go ahead and bring it into your scene. You'll just go to the top left where you can add things and then either just search. So while your mouse is still on the square cube button, you just search for post-process volume. Now, it's showing it under 3 different categories. All of them are the same, right? It's because it's under visual effects and volumes and also under all classes. Just drag any of them to your scene and it should look like the frame. If you hit F and find it, it will look like, we have G off, which is our overlay. So hit G, make sure you have your overlays back on. And then it looks like this empty cube. That's what the post-process volume looks like. So basically, all you have to do is control its details right here. It has a lot of options, and we're going to go through some of the most important options. So now that we have the post-process volume in the scene, we're just going to go inside it and start playing around with some of the parameters. So hit post-process volume, and let's start at bloom. Okay, this is my favorite. We're going to turn them on just like our material instances just to enable them and activate them. Let's turn on method and intensity. And already, if we go ahead and increase the slider, let's look at what happens to our light.
Magical.
Do you see that? It's adding a glow around our lights. If you look around, you'll see it as well.
What's going to happen if you go outside the cube?
So if I walk outside the cube, let's see what happens. Boom. Gone. See?
What if I don't want it to be only in the cube? I want it to be active all the time.
So there's a way you can do that. And the way you do that is by searching for UNB. That's a short term, but it's called unbound. So UNB, infinite extent unbound. By checking this, it says, hey, this post-process volume will work anywhere in the scene. So now that I'm outside, I'm still seeing the impacts of the bloom.
But I can have multiple post-process volume for a scene, right?
That's absolutely the case here. So if you were to uncheck this, imagine if you have a game, right? And you want to go ahead and place a post-process volume and then maybe scale it. You can absolutely change its size and say, okay, if I have a player and he's walking into this area, I want to increase the bloom and max it out because I have a fire in this location. And then when he walks out of this bounding box, I want to bring down the bloom. So you can have another, hold Alt, another post-process volume. So I have 2 now. And this one can have absolutely different settings. And that's fine. When the camera or the player walks into the other post-process volume, and we can check this right now, actually. The second post-process volume, let's go ahead and change its intensity to maybe like 8. So right now we're in the first one. And then if you go to the next one, you see the bloom, see the difference? This one is 4, this one is 8.
Makes sense.
So that's the whole reason why you have multiple post-process volumes. But usually for cinematics, where you're changing the levels based on every scene, usually we only have 1. We've only created 1 per scene so far. But you know what? It's good to know that you can have more than 1. So in our first post-process volume, let's first go ahead and click UNB, search for UNB, and turn it on so that it affects our entire scene so we don't have to be inside the post-process volume. And then we can go ahead and actually hide this one. We can just drag it anywhere in our scene so we don't see it anymore. Now, starting with we don't need mobile depth field. Our bloom, there is the standard function, and there is convolution. So convolution is more expensive, but it also works specifically with the light. So you don't see bloom applied to the entire scene. It only works on top of the lights. If you look closely, if I increase convolution, you see it only affects our lights, which is why it's more
realistic,
but also more expensive. But you might want to go for standard. Let's just keep standard for now. It's fine. So let's go. I don't know why all of them are open. I don't like the fact that all drop downs are open. I want to now go directly to lens flare. You see how we have lens flare? I don't like it. And that comes with our post-process volume. So if I open it up, by default, it's on 1. So all I have to do is either increase the intensity of my lens flare or decrease it to 0. I don't want to have any, so I'm going to disable it by decreasing it to 0. Now, the next thing, and also super important setting, is exposure. So you can have auto exposure, which by default is on in Unreal Engine. And what that does is, for example, if you're in an absolutely dark environment and suddenly go to a light environment, your eyes, your pupils change size to adjust to the lighting. Unreal Engine does the same thing, but sometimes you want to make sure it stays the same. So when you're going to different parts of your scene, your light is not changing. So to do that, you have two choices. One, you can change this auto exposure to manual. And by default, it's on 1, so you can increase it. And then now, everything in your scene will be sticking to this specific exposure. Or another way to do it is, instead of going to manual, we like to do it this way, changing your min and max EV to just 0. So this is now our default, the same exposure that we had, and it's not going to change anymore. This is your exposure. Chromatic aberration. If you played with After Effects and Premiere Pro and DaVinci, you will know this effect. It's basically changing the RGB and taking the RGB planes and just moving them. A lot of people like to use this for an artistic effect. I like to keep it either at a very minimal value, like 0.2, to help sell more of the photorealism, because some cameras actually have the chromatic aberration, which is why it exists as an effect. But you can also add it in post if you don't want to use it here. So you can just turn it off.
How we can add Vignette?
So Vignette is going to be under your image effects right here. So if you turn it on, by default it's on 0.4. By just increasing the value, it just makes your scene more cinematic because it puts all the focus in the middle of the scene, and the vignette around, the darker circles around your image is going to make it more cinematic. So maybe we can keep this at a value of 0.45. What do you say?
Yeah, I think that looks good.
I like that.
Yeah.
One more thing I like to say is dirt mask. So dirt mask is basically the dirt you're going to have on your lens to sell the realism. And that one is a texture that you have to bring in. We don't have it right now, so we're not going to add anything, but you can go ahead and bring in a dirt mask texture and add it over there. The camera settings, we're not going to touch because we're going to change that within the camera. We're going to skip everything else like depth of field. Again, everything can be done within the camera itself. Next up is color grading, right? Again,
you do that in DaVinci, right?
Exactly. I like to do it in post in DaVinci Resolve. That's where I'm used to all the settings, but you're more than welcome to change the settings here. You have access to global, shadow, global for everything, or separately, the shadows, the midtones, the highlights. And also, maybe we'll just change one of the settings here. How about we just play with the temperature? Since we know the scene is going to be dark and cold because it's the hangar for the bad guys, the Sith Lords. So we're going to reduce this number, see what happens.
Oh.
You see?
Have you come to destroy me,
Obi-Wan? You know, yesterday we saw the Japanese dub of Darth
so
Vader.
Good.
Dude,
I want to watch Star Wars in Japanese now.
The only thing that works in a dub, I would say, that doesn't make it cringy is if you change English to Japanese. But if you change Japanese to English, sometimes it becomes really cringy, like if you watch animes in dub. But yeah, so we just made it slightly colder, just a little bit. We don't have to. We can always change this. But now you see it's more of a filter, right? That's what post-process volume does. So these are your color gradings. Now the next thing we want to talk about, again, film does the same thing. You can change all of these settings. The next one we're going to talk about, which is really important, is your rendering settings, right? And this comes in really handy because technically you can directly access these settings either through your settings, right here, the project settings, which we're going to touch on in a moment, or through your console commands, which we're going to touch on as well later in this tutorial series. But they have a shortcut for you in the post-process volume, so you have access to some of the render settings. So let's see what they are. First of all, we have to look at, I'm going to close all these drop-downs because they're really annoying, because by default, they should be like this. Now, the next thing we're going to cover is the rendering settings that we can access within the post-process volume. Now, these are not all of your rendering settings, but some shortcuts that will help you quickly change some of those qualities in your renders. Now, by default, Unreal Engine 5 is using Lumen. So if you take a closer look here, for our GI, Global Illumination and Reflections, we're using Lumen. Farah, what is Lumen?
Can I cheat?
Yes, please.
Lumen is Unreal Engine's fully dynamic global illumination and reflection system.
Absolutely. So the reason why Lumen works really well with Unreal Engine 5 is because of how realistic it looks, at the same time because of how real time it is, which means we can work and move around scenes really quickly and have multiple different materials, multiple different assets, and have almost no noise.
What is the other option that we have besides Lumen?
Beside Lumen, we have another option, which is path tracing, right? And if you come from Blender or other 3D softwares, the Cycles render, for instance, is a path tracing render. That's a method of rendering. And if you have no knowledge of 3D rendering, then you should know this. So for us to be able to see and view these objects, the computer, the hardware, has to work with the software to create this look for you. How does it know what the metals should look like? How does it know how the metals should reflect like so that it looks like real metal? Well, there's different rendering engines and they work differently. But path tracing renders are actually the most physically accurate because they're actually bouncing out hundreds of different rays of light and then see how they will bounce off different materials and then come back to the camera, which is your eyes, and then make it as realistic as possible. Now, inside of Unreal Engine, we actually have access to a path tracing render, which is the most realistic, and we'll show you exactly how to access it. So right now, we're in Lumen, which is why we can move around the scene really quickly. There's no noise, almost no noise, and things are super smooth. But if you go to our lit view at the top left here, and then actually change this to path tracing. Now, if you don't have a strong computer, be careful with this. Make sure you save before you do this, because you might crash, again, depending on your computer. If you change it to path tracing, pay close attention to what happens to our materials. Do you see the difference? This looks a lot more realistic. Look at the roof, look at the ceiling, and you can actually see, if you pay close attention, the edges, the normal maps that we created. If you go back to Lumen, look at how light is being reflected. First of all, we lose detail in the top area, like right here, because it's trying to cancel out the noise and make this work in real time. But if you go back to the path tracing renderer and try to move around the scene, do you see the noise?
Yep.
If you come from Blender or other 3D software, this is what you're used to, right? This is why Lumen is so freaking good, because it looks almost as close as possible that it can to a path tracing render. It's not there yet, but it's close. But it can work in real time with 80 FPS right now with all these things in our scene. So if you go to our post-process volume, we have Lumen as our rendering method. Now we can go ahead and change some of its settings. Like for instance, for the global illumination, which is how it's illuminating our scene, we can go ahead and enable all these settings, and sometimes they're going to make a huge difference depending on what materials you have, what items you have. Let's say you have a forest, but sometimes they might not make that big of a difference. So if you go ahead and change, for example, our scene detail from 1 to 0, do you see what happens to our light here? And then change it back to 1. Do you see?
The reflections.
Exactly. And also here, scene lighting doesn't make that much of a difference, right? Final gather quality, not much of a difference right now. But the more items you add, you can keep playing with these values ready to go and then see what difference it makes to your scene. For us, it doesn't make that much of a difference, so we're not going to touch it. Default is great. The next thing is reflections. Now, I'm going to enable these, and let's just talk about quality. So right now it's at 1, reflection quality. Look at the top here. Look at what happens, Farhad, if I change this back to 0.25.
Noisy.
Do you see the noise?
Yeah.
Because the reflection quality is low, and then bring it back to 1. See the difference? We can take this number to something like 40, right? And there's a difference, right? 1 to 40, there's a slight difference. It's slightly brighter at the top, but it's not so noticeable. And remember, when you increase these sliders, your FPS
GPU
is going to take a hit. Now, the biggest difference is actually outside of the post-process volume. And since we're talking about rendering, Farhad, should we go and talk about the settings?
Let's go to project setting and then let's look at them.
I think that's a great idea. Because the problem right now is, if you look at the reflections here on this cube,
You don't even see the lights.
you do not. Oh, yes, I just noticed that. Yeah, where are these lights? Why are they not reflecting from this cube? And also, if I use right click and C to zoom in, look at the weirdness in the shapes. They're just so unclear, and I don't like it. So let's go to our rendering settings outside of the post-process volume. So we go to setting, we go to project settings. And then we're going to go all the way down to rendering right here. And you're going to be doing this almost every project, by the way. So make sure you get used to doing this. You're going to go down here. And depending on your computer, if you have an RTX-enabled graphics card like we do, a 4090, you can go ahead and use something called software and hardware ray tracing and ray traced shadows to increase the quality and the realism of your scene. So in order to change and enable those effects, one, under Lumen, we can enable hardware ray tracing when available. So pay close attention to the difference this is going to make. Okay, look at the reflections here and look at what happens. Hardware ray tracing enabled.
Boom.
Boom.
Lights are here.
Congratulations. So right now it's actually using our graphics cards ray tracing capabilities to be able to bounce off. And we can even see our area lights reflecting off of this cube, which is great, right? So the quality is better. It's not perfect yet. Now the next thing we're going to change is our ray lighting mode from surface cache to hit lighting for reflection. I don't even know if this is going to make a huge difference for our scene, but just looking at what the description is talking about, the hit lighting for reflection has better quality. So that's what we're going to do. And even if you don't do it, it did actually make a difference, right? But guess what, Farhad? We can actually change this one. This one already has a shortcut in our post-process volume. Let's quickly go back here. Check this out. Project default or no? Let's go to surface cache. See? We don't see half of our lights. Hit lighting for reflection.
Oof.
Boom. Now the reflections are perfect.
Yes.
It's freaking perfect. Okay? So again, some of these settings are in our post-process volume. Some of them are not.
Wait, listen. Did you know that you can create highly photorealistic scenes with photogrammetry by taking in what exists in the real world into 3D?
We've been using Polycam to do exactly that, using our phone and drone.
Yes, that's right. And guess what? They sponsored this video to give you guys 30% off their pro plan. So you guys can go ahead and try it for yourself.
Use the code BADDECISIONS in the link in the description. Back to the course.
So the last thing we're going to do is turn on ray trace shadows. Now, currently in our scene, because of our lighting setup, we're not going to see a big difference, but this is actually going to make your shadows a lot more realistic. Let us maybe see if it makes a difference here. Hold on. Yes. Perfect. See that? So right now, this cube is creating this shadow, which is not realistic, but you don't notice it because you don't know better. But check this out. Ray trace shadows.
Boom.
That is what the shadows are supposed to look like. So change your settings and make sure that your computer can handle it, though, before you do that. But if it can, change your settings and your scene is going to look a lot better.
I still have a question about post-process volume.
What is that?
Film grain. Can we add that?
Absolutely. We're going to do that. So let's go ahead and close the project settings. Let's go ahead and save. Make sure we have everything saved. And then we are going to close Global Illumination. And Farhad, right before getting to film grain, do you want to just test the quality and max reflection bounces
Let's
here?
go.
I just want to see if it's going to make any difference. So 0, no, 1. So in reflections, nothing. And then max reflection bounces. Oh,
yes.
Did you see that?
Yes.
So this was at 1, but because the lights will be reflecting multiple times, if we change it to 2, we're actually seeing these reflections on the wall inside this cube as well. If we change it to 3, yes, we'll see even more.
Yes.
But look at our FPS.
Oh, dropping.
Look at our FPS from 70 to 60. So be very careful. I want to keep it at 3. I want to keep it high. Or 2. I think 2 is good for us, right? We're going to find the middle ground. And now we're going to go to Farhad's request of
film grain.
Film grain, which is right here. So film grain is just going to emulate some film grain that you usually add in post. And we're going to enable it right here and increase it all the way to 1 so you see the difference. Look at the cube. Do you see the film grain?
Yep.
And then decrease it.
You can add it in DaVinci Resolve too. So
absolutely. I always like to add just a little bit here, like 0.3, because the more imperfection you add here, a small amount, and then later when you add a little bit more in post, it's going to make everything look less CG. And that is always our goal because we want to make it as photorealistic as possible. So I would say 0.3 is perfect.
Okay. So Faraz, you showed us the lumen settings, how we can change the path tracing settings.
Okay, that's actually a good question because the settings are here as well. Under path tracing, let's go ahead. This is for the path tracer nerds. Let's go change lit to path tracing right now. And we can go ahead and enable all of these options, okay? And then change the settings here. So you can go ahead and change the samples. Right now, look at this loading bar. It's loading in 2048 samples. So we have to decrease that number so that it doesn't take ages. Something like maybe 150, and you see how much faster that loading is. And then we can change the max bounces to a lower number like 3 is fine. Okay, it's gonna be enough. And then max path exposure to 13. This is usually my sweet spot. And then now we can go around the scene and then look at all these beautiful reflections. This is the most realistic way you can look at your scene if you're nerding out with path tracing. But for the continuation of this series, we're gonna go back to Lumen. Okay, perfect. And Farad, I think we are done with our post-process volume.
Guys, we are 10 chapters in. Next chapter, we are going to talk about HDRI and how you can add your own custom HDRI. So see you guys in the next video.